If you've consumed any content about trans rights, especially related to healthcare, you've probably heard a claim like this before.
And by the way, 80% of young people that have this so-called gender dysphoria, whether it's social media driven or not, grow out of it by the time they're 18. So it really makes no sense to give them cross-sex hormones or surgery, permanent solutions to a temporary problem.
Unfortunately for Frank Turek here, this claim of his is not actually true. This claim that 80% of young people diagnosed with gender dysphoria grow out of it by the time they're 18 is known as the Desistance Myth. Here's where it comes from. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, Edition 4, released in 1994, included diagnostic criteria for gender identity disorder. This included criteria for diagnosing children, such as persistence in wearing clothing stereotypical of the opposite sex, persistence in playing cross-sex roles in pretend play, intense desire to participate in pastimes stereotypical of the opposite sex, and strong preference for playmates of the opposite sex. It also included the criterion repeatedly stated desire to be or insistence that he or she is the other sex. However, it did not require that criterion to be met for official diagnosis. In the 20 years that followed, this disorder and its criteria was found to be inadequate for assessing issues of stress related to gender, so it was eliminated as a disorder in the DSM-5, which now contains updated, more specific diagnostic criteria for a different condition, gender dysphoria. For adults, these criteria revolve around a strong desire to be or identity with another gender. And for official diagnosis for children, one must meet the criterion a strong desire to be of the other gender or an insistence that one is the other gender. Now, the origin of this 80% desistance statistic originates from a 1995 study by Kenneth Zucker and Susan Bradley, where they found that out of the 45 gender nonconforming children in their study, 80% were not found to be transgender at follow-up in their high school years. Since this was 1995, none of these young people were ever diagnosed with gender dysphoria in the first place, and the sample actually represented a wide spectrum of gender nonconformity, not just those who actually desired to be or insisted they were a different sex or gender. I mean, the study contained kids who did not express desire to be or identification with another gender, but rather just preferred to dress or play differently than those stereotypical of their sex. This was not a sample of exclusively transgender or gender dysphoric kids by today's standards. Many other studies followed before the reform of gender identity disorder and its flawed diagnostic criteria. With samples that did not differentiate between those with a persistent desire or insistence to be the other sex and those who were gender nonconforming in other ways, researchers found wildly varying but significant rates of those who did not identify as another sex or gender in adulthood. In 2013, a particularly common source for the myth was published. This is the one I've personally seen cited the most, the infamous Thomas Steensma study. Certain people really like to quote this part of the introduction, which states that at the time of follow-up in adolescence or adulthood, these studies showed that for the majority of children, 84.2%, the gender dysphoria desisted. Now, if you check the citation for this, you find another of Steensma's studies published in 2011. So where in this 2011 study do we find that number? Also in the introduction, which is weird. Here, Steensma calculated that gender dysphoria persisted into adolescence for only 15.8% of dysphoric children. This implies that 84% of dysphoric children see their dysphoria desist. He calculated this number by combining the results from several previous studies. He does not show his work here, which is very unusual for scholarly psychiatric research. However, he does cite each of these previous studies, and there we find a few problems. Notice that 7 out of 10 studies were done even before gender identity disorder was standardized in 1994. A few date all the way back to the 1960s and 70s, when there was not yet any standard clinical understanding of gender identity. Even the most recent 3 were done before gender dysphoria replaced the defunct gender identity disorder. Without a clinical standard sufficient for classifying someone as having gender dysphoria versus other gender nonconformity, these studies could not have reliably identified samples made up of individuals who would be considered transgender or gender dysphoric by today's standards. So, this 84% desistance figure is meaningless, not to mention dubiously sourced. But what about the rest of Steensma's 2013 study? Doesn't it support the idea that a majority of gender dysphoric youths desist? Well, let's take a look. The study involved a sample of 127 youths diagnosed with gender identity disorder at the Center of Expertise on Gender Dysphoria in Amsterdam as children. So we're already dealing with a defunct diagnosis, which is insufficient for discerning between gender dysphoria and other gender nonconformity. But let's continue to see what else we find. They identified 37% of these participants as persisters, as they reapplied to the clinic in adolescence, requested medical treatment, were diagnosed again with gender identity disorder, and considered eligible for treatment. Meanwhile, 63% of participants did not return to the clinic, so the researchers counted them as desisters automatically. The participants could have not returned for any number of reasons other than their dysphoria going away, but I guess we'll never know. With methodological flaws this significant, any conclusion from this that a majority of gender dysphoric youths desist is not valid. You know what's interesting, though, is what the researchers involved in these two studies found from interviewing the participants who actually did show up at the clinic again. An excerpt from the discussion section of the 2013 study reads, "Persisters indicated that they believed that they were the other sex, and the desisters indicated they wished they were the other sex. This difference may also underlie our finding of a higher report of cognitive cross-gender identification in the persisters than in the desisters. Either they experience an alternative gender identification, or they interpreted the question differently. Nonetheless, explicitly asking children with gender dysphoria with which sex they identify seems to be of great value in predicting a future outcome for both boys and girls with gender dysphoria." That falls directly in line with current diagnostic criteria for gender dysphoria and contradicts the narrative that we should not listen to young people who persistently identify as another gender because they will most likely stop doing so in the future. The most popular source people cite for the desistance myth fails to support and even contradicts the myth itself. Now, recent studies that look at persistence rates of trans youths without relying on outdated diagnostic criteria do not find that most desist. A 2022 study published in the Journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics followed a sample of 317 youths who had made a binary social transition before the age of 12. At an average of 5.37 years after their initial transition, 94% were living as binary transgender youths, 3.5% were living as non-binary, and 2.5% were living as cisgender. Importantly, given all the political discussion around this, all those who retransitioned to cisgender did so by the age of 11, and only one ever received puberty blockers. None had received gender-affirming hormones. The authors stated, "These results suggest that retransitions are infrequent. More commonly, transgender youth who socially transitioned at early ages continue to identify that way." Studies of detransition rates in general, not just in youths, also find very low numbers. A recent systematic review of 27 studies involving a total of 7,928 transgender patients who underwent any type of gender-affirming surgery found that the prevalence of regret after gender-affirming surgery was 1%. Another recent study with a large sample size, almost 2,000 individuals who underwent gender-affirming surgery, found that only 6, that's 0.3%, either requested reversal surgery or transitioned back to their sex assigned at birth. I promise I'm almost done with statistics here, but I've just got to mention the largest survey ever done that assessed this issue, the 2015 US Transgender Survey. What did it find? 8% of respondents reported having detransitioned at some point. Most of those who detransitioned did so only temporarily. 62% of those who had detransitioned reported that they were currently living full-time in a gender different than the gender they were thought to be at birth. Respondents who had detransitioned cited a range of reasons, though only 5% of those who had detransitioned reported that they had done so because they realized that gender transition was not for them, representing 0.4% of the overall sample. The most common reason cited for detransitioning was pressure from a parent at 36%. 26% reported that they detransitioned due to pressure from other family members, and 18% reported that they detransitioned because of pressure from their spouse or partner. Other common reasons included facing too much harassment or discrimination after they began transitioning, 31%, and having trouble getting a job, 29%. So only a minuscule number of people who transition end up detransitioning, and it appears that most of the time they only do so because they face negative social consequences like discrimination from family, friends, and even employers. We absolutely should be compassionate toward those who regret their transition, just as we should be compassionate toward those with vaccine injuries. But being compassionate toward that very small statistical minority does not have to entail placing restrictions on the vast majority. Taking away evidence-based medical intervention for the vast majority who do benefit from it hurts far more people than it could ever potentially help. What we should not do, though, is get our information about matters of science and healthcare from people like Frank Turek, a man with a PhD in Christian ministry and no education in any scientific discipline. He clearly has not read or understood the studies he's attempted to cite here. Given Turek's strong affiliation with Republican political efforts, I have a pretty good guess for where he picked up this falsehood. In the US, the Desistance Myth is one of the most common myths presented in hearings on legislation that would affect trans rights to healthcare and access to public spaces. The state of Montana passed a ban on certain medical treatments for minors with gender dysphoria, where proponents cited this myth as part of its justification.
The false narrative that there is something wrong with you. Here, take some drugs that will forever alter you, alter your future choices, leave you with regret, that you will probably grow out of. 80% of people will come to their natural gender.
The conservative think tank, which ironically claims to protect individual freedom, the Heritage Foundation, has also shared this myth. And of course, conservative lawyers have even spread the myth on Fox News.
Teenage transitioners desist from transition at a 80 to 90% rate.
Yeah, it seems that Frank Turek gets his information about issues of science and medicine from sensationalistic right-wing sources. Still, though, he makes a career of writing, speaking, and doing media appearances where he positions himself as some sort of expert on trans psychology and healthcare. In certain political and religious spheres, this is somehow seen as perfectly acceptable. The effect of this pseudoscience and pseudo-academic practice, though, is to motivate politically powerful yet uninformed people to legislate against access to evidence-based healthcare for gender nonconforming people. This ultimately serves a conservative religious agenda, but misleads many into thinking that they're just going by the science. So, the next time you hear someone make this claim, ask if they've read the studies behind it, and if they think the methodology of those studies holds up to scrutiny, or if the studies even suggest their conclusion in the first place. Or, you can just send them this video. Thanks for watching. All of my sources are, of course, linked in the description. This video is just one part of a much longer video where I dispel several popular myths about LGBT psychology and healthcare. If you'd like to check that out, it's linked in the description. And if you're watching this within the first week or so of this video's release, the longer video will be out soon. I'll see you then. Oh, and stay skeptical.